And that is critical. Too much of at least in my experience, oftentimes in churches, people talk about what they believe, what they think, what their opinion is. And the question I want to ask them is, but what do you think is God's will for this? Because it's really not important what I think. What's important is what I think and understand and discern the will of God to be. So discernment is the critical element when you're making this consensus decision making. And that means when someone else speaks, the question you're asking yourself is, what is God saying to me in what they are saying? What do I understand to be the right thing to do as a community of faith? And so when somebody says something, especially if it's something I don't agree with, to hear them clearly, I need to ask myself, what are they saying to me that may be a word from God on this matter that I haven't heard, or I haven't discerned, or I haven't thought about? That is just as critical as anything. It reflects a theological perspective that says the church is not a democracy. We tend to think a church is a democracy and everybody has a right to their opinions. That is not the case. The church is a theocracy, different from the government. The United States is not a theocracy, it's a democracy. But when it comes to the community of faith we are part of, something else is at work, and that is that we believe in God. And so we're trying to do what God wants us to do. That makes it a theocracy. And that's why discernment is so critical. The next item, I'd say, the quality that we're looking for is as we listen, are we reading the room? That is to say, are we paying enough attention to what everybody is saying and not saying that we can get a sense of where people are? And unfortunately, as wonderful as Zoom is, and I think it is wonderful, it makes it much harder. Mm-hmm. I have found that when you can't see people, you can't see their body reaction, their movement, their facial expressions aren't as clear. It's very hard to read what's going on with them. And so it's harder to read a room when you are on Zoom. And so it just takes a little more work, maybe a little more time, and a process of asking people more than just listening, but making sure that everybody is is attentive to what is being said. And what do you think of that? How did you respond to that? What are you feeling? Not just what are you thinking, but what are you feeling? And reading people, feelings are really important, as we all know. And I just know Zoom makes that much harder. For example, I can't see much of any of you except your head. You can see my shoulders and my head. You really don't know what my hands are doing, or whether I'm when I'm not talking, am I paying attention? It's just much harder. When you're in person, you know. And that's really important, because it's hard to get consensus if you don't know where people are in that process. And so you just have to realize that. And it's harder to do one other thing, which is to nudge participation. I mean, the one thing that works against consensus as much as anything else is when people don't participate. It's huge to be a participant. And so maybe one of the qualities of being a member of the regional board when a new person comes on is, are you willing to participate in the process of decision making through consensus? And so participation, expressing what you feel and what you think, is critical. And when you're reading the room, somebody can call that person out. You can say, Chris, you haven't said anything, and I see you thinking. I see the expressions on your face, but you haven't said anything. Do you have anything you want to say? They don't have to say something, but at least they are nudged toward participation. So you read the room enough to get some sense of where people are, and you can, and don't be afraid, any of you, especially whoever is leading, to say, where are we on this?
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. Where are we on this? Because I feel, so this is just me, but I just feel like, hey, we have a guest presenter here, and we need to give him our full attention. And I know that I just think we do. I think we need to look up. I think we need to say, hey, Jan, we're glad you're here tonight, and we're gonna be fully involved. That's just me. Y'all may disagree, but when he's talking about reading a room and I'm reading the screens and everybody's doing something or looking off somewhere, I'm thinking, dang, if this was my youth group, I'd be saying something. So I'm saying something.
Okay. So Sandy, can I say something too?
Yeah, love y'all.
Okay, so one of the things in response to that, so part of how I learn and how I listen better is to do something with my hands. I listen better when I'm doing something like doodling or something like that. So for me, that's how I listen. But my question is like, if consensus works okay with a group of 12 or 15 or 18 people, I was thinking about our regional assembly this last time, and even the crazy, ridiculous conversation about Chris's address. Like, how could we possibly have a consensus conversation with 100 people who are flipping out over particular words in a bylaw? Like, how does that like logistically work?
Okay, so we're going to ask our presenter because I have no idea.
Yeah, and that's what it was. Yeah.
The thing I wouldn't know how to do is how to bring them back in for consensus, for any kind of consensus. Like, that was a difficult situation. Eileen and Dick and I, and we were floundering, not gonna lie, we were floundering. And yeah, I don't know what we would have done with consensus.
Can I ask a question, Chris? And it goes, for those of us that had the adaptive learning,
right?
A lot of that is kind of, for at least the leaders of the discussion groups, it's opposite. You sit in the silence and you let people feel uncomfortable to get them. So it's kind of opposite of this. So how I'm kind of wrestling with this, and I'm taking notes. So Sandy, that's how I learn. So I have to write down what he's saying.
Me too.
So
I'm taking notes
sorry
too.
if that means I'm not looking at the screen. But what I'm hearing is if the leaders and engagement in those discussions are feeling that adaptive leadership model, then it means the rest of the participants in the discussion have to do what Jan is recommending. It just seems like right now there's kind of some tension here in these two leadership thought process that we're trying to merge.
There might be. I actually was seeing it just the opposite. When Jan was talking about reading the room, that's one of the key things. Get up in the balcony and read the room. Read people where they are. Pay attention to their body language and who they're talking to. So I think there's probably different ways but I don't think it's a binary. Consensus is this and adaptive is that. Right? I think there's probably going to be some living into this in a way, and that's also adaptive, right? Living into this in a way that fits who we are and exploring ways to do this.
Yeah, I just think it's fair to acknowledge that there's tension there, and we'll have to figure out how to balance that and how to work that.
Could be.
That was my point.
Real quickly, in terms of drawing people back, the one thing to know about regional assembly is by state law, if we're going to amend the bylaws again, you have to have a vote. You can't use consensus. So there's one place.
Okay.
So and that's
so can I say something?
Sure.
Just as an aside, as an outside, I would say, go ahead.
Yeah, Julie, go ahead, please.
I would like Jan to continue talking because I really was listening to everything he said and I enjoyed it. I feel like we disrupted his momentum. So could you please continue, because you have a wealth of information that I consciously or subconsciously I know, but consciously I need to hear again. So please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the comments, Sandra. I really, I think how you read the room and what people are doing does matter. So I appreciate that. As I go back to it, I think we have to be clear in terms. I don't know what you're talking about with adaptive leadership, but remember, we're talking about decision making. We're not talking about leadership. This is not about how to lead a group. This is about how to get a group to make a decision that creates unity, even if there is not unanimity. So I don't know enough about what you're talking about with adaptive leadership, but I do know that consensus decision making is not about leadership, because there is no effort in a group for one person to lead the others. And if in fact that is taking place, then consensus is breaking down already before it ever starts. I mean, one of the dangers of consensus making is that somebody uses it to manipulate the group. So that's very important to keep in mind. That's why everybody is a leader at the point of their contribution. And everybody is a follower at the contribution from someone else. So it's not about leadership. Now, just to also respond to the question about Melissa with the assembly, you can never impose consensus making on a group that hasn't already begun to experience it and committed to it. So there is no way to bring consensus decision making into a situation that has not already embraced it. So, but the size of the group doesn't matter. We made decisions at Spirit of Joy as a congregation, all the way down to whether or not we actually purchase a building. Everything we did was by consensus, but we were already committed to it and people were trained in it. They were used to consensus making. So it has to be done by a group that is already committed to it and engaged in it, just as an aside. Okay, so not sure where I was, but I do want to emphasize.
You were on the 4 steps and then you got to the last one.
Okay, and so let me just go back and say patience, discernment, and listening is a part of that. reading a room, paying attention, that the goal is not unanimity, but the goal is unity. One other thing I want to say is, remember, nothing is irreversible. I mean, if you make a decision as a group and then realize later that you really don't think that was the right decision, you can always come back to it. I mean, unless you're spending money and you've already spent it, then you've learned a lesson. But other than that, we have to, I think it helps to keep in mind that this is an ongoing process. And so you can always come back to an issue. Because it has been decided doesn't mean it's in concrete. And we think that way too much, I think, in church. That once a decision is made, we got to move on. No, because people have discerned more later than they might have at the moment. And again, if discernment is a critical process, then it's ongoing. It's never stopped. Just because the meeting is over, discernment continues. You mull it over, you pray about it, you think about it more. And that's why it takes time to make decisions by consensus. Now, there has to be a context, at least our experience, and this is something I learned from Dr. Trueblood and the Quakers I knew. And by the way, Richard Foster is a Quaker. So if you read his book, you'll get that flavor. In the Quaker tradition, consensus decision-making is a reflection of the whole context of life together. And so they would never try to do consensus decision-making without first worshiping. And so we did that at Spirit of Joy. Our church council, as we called it, the first thing we did was for somebody to lead us in worship. And it might take 5 minutes, it might take 15 minutes. But whatever they wanted to do to lead us in worship, we worshiped together before we did anything else. That's how we began the meeting with 5 minutes of silence. So if someone came in late, they could sit in silence and know that we're going to all be in silence. And then the silence was broken and we worshiped. The second thing we did was to catch up with each other. To ask the question, Gary, what did you bring to this meeting? When you came tonight to be fully present, how are you? Because all of us come from our homes, maybe from work, whatever, and we're bringing stuff to the meeting. We got to be clear about that. We don't have to share it. We don't have to spill it over. We don't have to talk about it. But we have to be aware that whatever we have brought to that meeting may influence how we are responding to what is going on. And it's very important. So we would always say, okay, where is everybody tonight? Is there anybody with something troubling them deeply and they're trying to concentrate on this meeting when in fact their heart is broken? Or they're worried to death about somebody they found out in the family is sick or something else is going on. You got to know that. And to take the time to do it. Remember, I said this takes time. Then we would have silence after the worship for at least a minute or two to collect ourselves, to assemble ourselves and not just each other. And then close the worship time with prayer. And then we would identify the topics. And we would often discern that we're not going to get through all of this tonight. And so what do we really feel like needs to be discussed, and let the other go to the next meeting, because if we rush through it all, we won't do any of it well, but we cannot possibly cover everything tonight. So we would look at the agenda to see what is possible and what is not. And then once we got that clear, we would begin discussing whatever we needed to talk about. We also had a commitment. I think, is your meeting from 6:30 to 8:30? Is that the time? And I'm sure you're doing it, but we had a commitment. If 2 people were present at 6:30, we were going to begin the meeting. We weren't going to wait for others. The meeting begins, and then the meeting ends when the time has been designated. We didn't run over. If we got to 8:30 and we still had agenda items, we would say, it's 8:30. We've made a commitment to everybody ahead of time. We're going to quit. So we just are. And we will pick up where we left off the next time we meet. If something is so urgent that somebody has to take care of it, then the group can designate 1 or 2 people to do something in between the meetings. But it's very important to be, as a group, to be faithful to each member in terms of commitment of beginning time and ending time. And when you get a consensus, you just ask for it. I mean, you really just, it's that simple. Do we have a consensus that this is the right thing to do, or that we are not going to do this at this time? Have we made that commitment to each other? And if somebody says, well, I'm not sure, then the next question would be, well, tell us what else you're thinking. What insight do you have for what you think God wants us to do, Linda, that you haven't shared already, that can help us understand your reluctance? Because we want to know why you are just not ready to give consensus to this. And so the only way to find out is to ask you to be free and trust us that you can share whatever it is. And so it's important to that's why reading the room is so important. Because you do not want consensus to be simply the absence of someone not speaking up when they still have things to say. That's not consensus. That's kind of group pressure. And you don't want that. And while you may not be able to do that initially, eventually everybody will begin to trust that. I promise you. Eventually people will believe that this is exactly what you really mean when you say consensus. You want everybody to say whatever it is they think is important. Now, again, what I said at the beginning, we're not asking what is my opinion. We're asking what do I sense the leading of God to be on this decision we've got to make. But you don't always agree, and everybody has to feel free to say what they want to say. And if you do this a few times, I promise you, people will trust it. They will. They will actually say, we really mean this. This is true. Now, one of the big benefits of it is it eliminates all parking lot small meetings. There's no point to a parking lot small meeting to fuss about what was decided, because they still have to come back and get a consensus. There is nobody who can build up a group of people who then outvote everybody else. That's not the way it works. And so I would say that if you talk to people who were at Spirit of Joy during those years, you'd find out that they would say, you know, we never had any gossip outside trying to build a small group that would come into a meeting and get their way by means of a vote, because you can't do it. It's not possible if you're doing it by consensus. But also the bigger and more important thing is people really feel like they had a voice. You have a voice when others are listening to that and mean that they want to hear what you say, even if they don't agree with it. It builds relationships, it builds trust, and I think, frankly, it makes better decisions. And as I said, some decisions are pretty easy to make, but there are a few decisions, actually not many, but there are a few decisions for a group like this where it'll be tough to take the time to get a consensus, because it's a difficult and very important decision. And there are a few of those that groups have to make. But they're always the best decisions when you make it this way. Doesn't mean you're going to be right all the time. Just because it's consensus doesn't mean you got it right. But it means you did everything in your power to get it right. And that is what you can tell other people. You know, we thought this was the right decision, and I can promise you, we prayed about it, we were discerning about it, we reached the best decision we thought we could make. If it's wrong, let us know how it is wrong, and we will think about it again. We'll make another decision, perhaps, but at least we'll consider it. But we're not saying it's absolute, but it is absolute in terms of us doing the very best that we could on the decision. Okay, I've talked enough now. So what are the questions? Comments, anything?
So I have a question. If I remember right, so we decided at Regional Assembly to not do Robert's Rules anymore and do consensus. So how do we, when you said everybody has to know how to do it first before we get there, how do we teach an entire region how to do consensus over the next 2 years before the next Regional Assembly? And I know this isn't just about Regional Assembly, that's just what's in my mind most pertinently right now, of how to like I said, trying to get a group of 6 or 12 or 15 people to listen and discern what God is calling us to do, and then arrive on a similar page is hard enough, let alone 150 people or more from an entire region who don't have you to come and present to them. So I don't know, just from a logistical standpoint, no, it's just.
Well, I would think that experience would be one of the best teachers of that. I mean, I would assume that you have more than one 12 or 15 member group doing this throughout the region. If you have 15 people who've tried it and nobody else, and you have 150 people deciding, you're not going to do it. It's not going to work. But if you voted, and that's kind of ironic, but if you decided to do consensus making as a region, then I would assume that means that all of your meetings, consensus decision making is the process you're using. So if that's the case, then more than this group are experiencing what that's like. And so through experience, you begin to learn at least some of the things that it's about and some things it's not about. You cannot give in to anybody saying, let's vote on this. Because the criticism of consensus making is it's just a slower way of voting. No, that's not what it is at all. So I think hopefully other groups are experiencing the same thing if you've decided as a region that you're not going to be using Robert's Rules of Order. That would be my response. I don't know enough about your region otherwise to know. Other questions, Gary?
This is Gary. I have a comment. And probably a question for you. I served on a national board for Lutheran Volunteer Corps for a period of about 9 years, and just went off about a year ago. But we use consensus in our decisions for the whole time. And I appreciate your comments. One of the phrases that we frequently used was extending the conversation. You've talked about that patience, and really what that required for us oftentimes was a longer conversation, more conversation. Two things about that. One is, at least in the way we practiced, we did a number of ways of getting one another to talk invitational. So I'm speaking, and then I say the next one, Chris, I'm done. Chris, what do you have to say? And we didn't so much have the option of saying, I have nothing to say. It really was, no, say what's on your mind. Speak your truth at the moment. You either agree or you disagree, or you've got something to say about it. So we did use that, and that became pretty effective for us getting everybody to participate when we didn't do it so much initially. But one of the things that we had to do along the way in a couple of the tougher decisions was come to an agreement that we're not going to reach consensus. I as a board member am not ever going to get to the same point as being comfortable with the rest of you on this. But I, as an individual member, need to step back and say, I'm going to let this go forward, and allowing that unity to be there. Certainly not unanimity, but that was my way. And I'm of saying, yes, I can be in unity with you. I'm not going to agree with it, but there can be unity in this, and we can go forward. I'm not going to be the one that stops this decision from being made, or this action from being taken. Do you have some comments for that about those very difficult situations where there might just be me against the other 12 on the call?
Very good point, Gary. We called it stepping aside. And let's say we had a discussion tonight and everybody seemed to be in agreement, said they were, but you weren't. The first question I would ask you is, Gary, is there anything else you can say that you haven't already said to us that helps us understand where you are? And if you say, well, no, I think I've made myself clear, then I would say, well, as you can see, the group seems to be in consensus except for you or you and John Doe. Are you willing to step aside and let the will of the group go ahead with us fully knowing that you are not doing this because you agree, but you're doing this for the sake of unity on the decision? And if your wisdom proves to be the case later, then we'll come back and visit this subject. But for now, are you willing to step aside? That's what we asked. And one of the things we used to say at Spirit of Joy is that stepping aside takes a real high level of spiritual maturity. I mean, that's what we're after here, is spiritual maturity. Any Tom, Dick, or Harry, or Jane, or Jean can make decisions and be adamant or obstinate or in agreement. It takes spiritual maturity to try to reach a decision that you believe is reflective of what God would want the group to do. And if you don't agree with that, but be able to step aside, that shows a lot of spiritual maturity on a person's part.
Mhm.
And so we would say that. Thank you for your spiritual maturity and being willing to do that, because that speaks well of you and who you are and your commitment to this group. So we would not in any way, we would try to keep that person on their side. We would want that person to still feel a part of what we have done if they're willing to step aside.
How is stepping aside different from conscience?
Pardon?
How is stepping aside different from I can't agree with this out of conscience?
Well, I think that it's the same. Stepping aside is that in spite of not being able to agree with this on the basis of conscience, I'm willing to let the group move ahead, and I'm not going to drop out, withdraw, or quit. But I'm going to be a part of the group because this is my community. And so it's not inconsistent with, I would assume that anybody making taking objection to a group decision is probably doing it on the basis of conscience or discernment of what is right. As long as we're seeking to do the will of God, remembering it's a theocracy. So one of the things you have to do, I say, at least our experience was, we had to keep reminding ourselves of just about everything I've said tonight. We just didn't get it once, and then we all had it, and we knew what was. We had to keep reminding ourselves. Wait a minute. Somebody would start disagreeing. Another thing is, in consensus decision making, you don't say, Gary, I disagree with you on this. What you say is, I hear what you're saying, Gary, but my view is this. So that I'm not arguing with you, I'm just sharing my perspective. And in consensus building, you don't argue with each other, because arguing means that your view, your point of view is not legitimate. I'm gonna be aggressive, and I'm gonna try to keep you from winning the argument. It's not about persuasion. We're not trying to persuade each other. We're trying to hear each other, but we're also trying to say, okay, with all the viewpoints, where is the will of God in this? As best we can discern it, knowing we're not going to do it perfectly. We can make mistakes. There's nothing that says we have to discern the will of God perfectly. We just have to try to do it as best we can. So we don't argue with each other. And we certainly don't come back at each other. And we had a lot of people who had to learn that. And you just simply say, wait a minute. We're not here to debate and argue with each other. We're here to share our own discernment on this issue. And so let's be respectful of what everybody is saying, and let's listen carefully.
Very good.
Can you share like something specific that your congregation processed through, and how kind of some of that back and forth worked, like as more of a concrete example?
Well, two examples I can think of. One is that when we were trying to decide whether to buy the building we were renting, involved help getting the region to help us, and so the region said they would help us, and Church Extension was going to give us the loan, and so we had to be willing to take on a mortgage, and we had no money. And so it was a big step for us. And so we had to talk through that. And it took several discussions. We didn't make that decision quickly. And it finally emerged that we were willing to do it. We had some people who had to step aside. They just didn't think that it was the right decision. And the reason everybody reached consensus except this one couple is we kept saying, well, what is our alternative? If we had it was an offer that almost you couldn't refuse. Because one of the things that was an element in the process was that the church that owned the church building we were using said they'd be willing to use all of the rent we had been paying them for 2 years as a down payment. That we had things like that. So the question was, well, what is the alternative? They would just keep renting, and eventually they'll sell the building to somebody else because it was for sale, and then we'll have to find somewhere else. So how is it better for us not to take this step forward if we're going to have a future? So that was, and so it took a long time. The other situation, and I don't know that this is a good thing to tell you, but I'll tell you anyway. We here in Minnesota, disciples are not well known, as you know. When you tell somebody in Minnesota, I'm a member of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, their next question is that Lutheran? That's the way they think about it. Well, they all practice baptism by infant baptism, Catholics and Lutherans, 87% of the population here. So we had a lot of families joining Spirit of Joy who had babies because we were a very young congregation. We had 2 funerals in 14 years. That tells you how young we were. And some of them wanted to sprinkle those infants, to baptize those infants. And so the question came up, do we as a Christian Church Disciples of Christ agree to baptize the infants of those people who request that we do so? And that was a big decision. And the Sunday we thought we had consensus enough to bring it to the congregation, we'd been discussing it in our church school classes. A couple, a disciples minister and his wife, raised question again about it. We had this long discussion. And what we said at the end of that discussion was, we obviously are not ready to bring this decision to the congregation. We don't have consensus. And so we postponed it. I think we went another 2 or 3 months. Another one we had was before gay marriage was legal here in Minnesota. We had a lesbian couple that came for about a month, and then they came to Joy and me and asked if we would perform a commitment ceremony for them. And our answer was, if you're asking us as clergy to do it outside the church, yes, we will. But if you're asking us, will we do it in the sanctuary of the church where we worship, then we can't do that unless the congregation is willing to affirm it. We're not going to just sneak in and have a Saturday night wedding or commitment ceremony and not have the congregation as a part of that. And we said, we don't actually know what the congregation will say. And so if you're willing to work with us to go through a discernment process to get consensus on whether or not the congregation will affirm us doing the commitment ceremony, then we'll do that. But if you don't want us to do that, then we can't have it at the church. We can do it somewhere else, but we can't have it at the church. Well, they were willing to go through that, and we promised them we had no idea how it would come out. And so we did. And we actually reached consensus when And I think it was because of all the other things we were talking about. We were not an open and affirming congregation. We never wanted to be an open and affirming congregation. What we said was, that's a political decision. For us, this is a church decision. And the question for us was not, are we open and affirming? The question is, what does it mean to be church? And so we said, as a Disciples of Christ congregation that says explicitly the table belongs to God and not to us, we don't get to decide who can come to the table and who can't. And so we were open, and whether you affirmed it or not was immaterial. Everybody was welcomed at Spirit of Joy, regardless of sexual orientation, because the table belonged to God and not to us, and that's what it meant for us to be church. That was our view. So we didn't know how the congregation would respond to this issue. And one of our members, who tended to be, as she shared her views and her theology, tended to be more conservative than most, one Sunday said, I look at that sign out there and it says, we minister to all. And how are we going to say that we do that if we say we minister to all, but except people who happen to be in a gay or lesbian relationship? And when she said that, it was immediately clear we had consensus. And so we had it. And that's how we did it. But we entered into it honestly not knowing how it was going to go. As I said, that's too much to tell you. And so we had some tough decisions to make. But I can honestly say we stuck with consensus decision making. We did not give up on it. And it meant taking a little bit longer than we would have taken had we voted. But I think you're wise as a region. Voting divides the church. I just can't believe Jesus called us to vote on whether or not we do this or that. That's, when the Christian Church Disciples of Christ followed the dean of Christian Theological Seminary in 1946, who wrote the book, The Church Functioning Effectively, and basically brought the business model of organization into the church to break the power of the elders who were running everything. It ruined the church because it brought an alien model into the life of the church so that we function well as a business, but it kills us in terms of church. That's my opinion. You didn't ask for it, and so you can ignore it. But that's what I think. So, and that's what I taught Chris at the seminary too. Whether he's told you that or not, that's what I taught him.
Yep.
So, anyway, okay. Other questions?
So
Go ahead.
I'd like to make an observation if I could.
Okay.
A few of us have gone through the adaptive leadership program, which is in Kansas. And I'm seeing a very good marriage between the two models in which you're talking about. And whichever way that you may be coming from, you might say one houses the other one better. I don't know. I know that, but yeah, I've always heard of consensus, but have we ever really had that modeled for us in life? Probably not so much. Learning the adaptive leadership, though, for me, would be a house of a structure, for lack of a better word, to utilize. I'm very comfortable following that model, and I would like to, I can see how fulfilling it with the consensus model is a complement to each other. And I really liked your definition of theodicy versus democracy. I mean, yeah. And then I also, so one thing that I would, a couple of things, I guess. One would be that for me, I would have somebody with me as a tag team on the balcony, and the both of us could keep that monitored. What I mean by that is, so when questions come awry or people, somebody could say, oh, hey, Julie, let's ask this person what they're thinking. It would be verbal cues and reminders to do these check-ins that you're talking about around the table so everybody can weigh in on the discussion. I can see that is great. Another would be when you were talking, well, the divisiveness, it does eliminate that, and that does need to be eliminated in churches. If people aren't going in for, artillery and battle so that they can declare their opinion or state, when we take the attitude, what we learned in adaptive leadership is we're going to experiment with this and we're going to try it for 6 weeks, and then we're going to come back and revisit it. No harm, no foul. What did we learn from it? Let's try and pick up, and the parts that work, let's move on again. And like you said, sometimes that can be a little costly depending on the money that is out, but otherwise it's actually just experimenting with ministry. So I appreciated that. I also really loved your focus question. That number one is, what is it you believe God is calling us to do and be and think? And then what I would do is I would follow it up with, well, let's go to the scriptures and see how God's teaching us how to handle these discussions together. I think, so for me, that's a complete merriment. And so yes, thank you so much. Now, in a perfect world, I'm going to have all the patience of Job and beyond to do this. In reality, I'm going to need a few people to help me do that. So I thank you for your time. It's very good. And I wish you could talk to us every time about this, because I'm obviously going to need this talk more than once in my life.
That's a good segue. Can I jump in, Sandy and Jan?
Absolutely.
Just in light of time, I think you're right, Julie, and that's the plan. You'll see on the agenda there, because of all the changes that we're making, consensus decision-making, adaptive leadership, a whole new structure around 4 centers with a new purpose statement. So there's a lot of orientation time that's going to be spent in these meetings. I think that's my anticipation. We may ask Jan if he'd be willing to come back and continue this conversation. So know that this isn't the end. I do wonder, there was one item under regional ministers report that we didn't get to that requires a decision. And that's about my sabbatical that I was supposed to take in 2023. And I wonder if we couldn't use this with Jan in the room to kind of explore, play, as he said, we have to experience it. So maybe we look at that resolution and open it up, and I don't know where it'll go. So you may want to keep close tabs on the time because we're close to 8:20. But that's one thought. I don't know how others think or feel.
Thumbs up if we're going for that. That would be awesome. Chris was scheduled to do his sabbatical this year, and in light of his accident and but not just that, it's all of this newness that we're incorporating. We have at the executive board and his we call it Chris's medical team, talked about moving it to 2024, where he would be gone for 3 months. And that's what we have brought forth to you to give consensus to, basically. So Chris, do you have anything to say about that, or what would you like to say?
No, I think the resolution tries to capture all the different elements. So if there are questions about what's in the resolution or concerns that people want to express, or affirmations, I mean, that's always good too.
Yeah. Does everybody have the resolution that you all have seen it? Yes. Okay. So we're good on that. Questions for Chris? Anybody? Anybody have any thoughts?
I don't have any questions, but I feel that moving it a year makes a whole lot of sense. And for the reasons that Chris has already mentioned, or I guess Sandy, you did, not only the health, but all the changes we're making. I think it makes sense for the region. It makes sense for Chris.
Agree. I know I would like to have a year under my belt before being the moderator before Chris is gone for 3 months. You know, and the other thing I would like to say is I feel like we have a really, really good team. And I just thank you. You're good people. So I appreciate you.
This is Gary. I have a question about the and it's not spelled out in the sabbatical resolution, but my wondering is, what's the expectation following the sabbatical? Is there an expectation that the sabbatical is followed by a continued period of coming back? And I know we can't know the future, especially Chris, with what's going on, but is there any expectation about that surrounding the sabbatical, or was there ever, is my question.
Eileen may be better able to answer that as the chair of the search committee who helped kind of rewrite the personnel policies, but the personnel policies simply state that after 5 years, I will get a 3 month paid sabbatical in addition to vacation leave and other education leave that's in my letter of call. So there's no expectation on the back end. It's simply after 5 years, there's 3 months.
And so for next year, it will be year 6, 3 months, and then his regular vacation and everything. And I want to say Chris has been very, very diligent about writing down his medical leave stuff. And I know in working with him for the last few months, I don't really think he's taken medical leave. I think he has diligently worked as much as he's been able to from his doctors. And honestly, I'm not seeing it. So we'll talk about that further down the road, but he's been a rock star through all of it. And he has been very diligent in monitoring his time and his level of being able to do things and keeping that balanced. So yeah, I just want to throw that out there. So.
And yeah, I appreciate that. I don't know if that was connected to my question or not. I'm not questioning or disputing any of those things. I'm just trying to think of the future of the region, and what are we thinking if there's a 3 month sabbatical in 2024? Do we need to be thinking about what happens after that, or are we thinking that Chris is coming back? And so I think that conversation needs to be had. Maybe this is not the right time to have that, but as that sabbatical comes about in 2024, that's probably a good thing for us to have in the back of our mind.
Well, okay, but really, We're not letting him go anywhere. We've already had consensus about that. So just saying.
So, Gary, I think what I had planned to do this year was to spend the year kind of getting people geared up for a sabbatical. Like, what is it? Why do you get one as a minister? Helping local churches to consider the place of sabbatical. And then just framing out, well, what are the themes that I'll be doing? What I've what I've designed so far is that I want to take a look at transitions. So this regional church will be going through a transition when I retire, if you allow me to stay until I retire. And I'll be transitioning into retirement. And so how can we think about that together? Because this regional church is really kind of not fully financially there. What does that mean? And so it's a chance to really take a deep dive and look at that. But embedded in that is my anticipation that I would plan to come back until I hit my 65th birthday, which would be in 2026. But like you said, I can't make promises. What I can do is just say, here's where my thinking is. Here's the writing that I've done so far, the planning I've done so far.
So, okay, back to our agenda.
I just like to say, I'm opposed to Chris's sabbatical, but I'll step aside.
That's great. Dan,
I know where to find you.
Yes. We really do want to thank you for being with us tonight. You've been an invaluable help. And yes, I think we'll be having you back again.
I'll be glad to do it.
Okay.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan.
Future board topics are, I think you're planning on this, Chris. In our May meeting, we'll have our board manual, roster, contact info, everything, right? If you have a chance to sign up for the adaptive leadership stuff, we have scholarships available, and we can do it online or we can do it there. So contact Chris if you are interested in either of those options. I know that he or Nate will be sending out information of when we need to sign up, especially if we're doing the online training. So watch for that. The Tri-Region Partnership Initiative, Chris, do you have anything you would like to say about that?
Not right now. I just wanted you to know that I'm well aware that those are 3 topics that are really,
we have to.
Yeah, and we just wanted to acknowledge it. Tonight was a deep dive into consensus, and
it was, and it was very good.
But can I jump in? It's Gary again. I'm sorry I'm jumping in so much, but I'm concerned that if we're this is a great time to start practicing consensus, but we never arrived there. We only had me asking a few questions and Jan stepping aside. So I do think as a group, we need to all come together and say whether we are in consenting to the sabbatical as presented to us, if everybody's there to make sure, and is anybody stepping aside? Do we have more? I wish we would do that a little bit further, even though we're really close on time, I know.
No, that's fine, Gary. And honestly, to each of you, being a moderator is new to me. So always step in and go, Sandy, hello. So
then I guess I misunderstood. I thought we were just tabling or going to talk about it next time because we were running out of time and we decided it was something we didn't have to decide now. Am I the only one that got that from the conversation?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm just asking, was I the only one that didn't interpreted it that way?
I interpreted it as we needed to probably talk about it. That's how I interpreted.
Yeah.
And not talk about it, but come to a decision or an agreement or consensus.
In the steps that he detailed that I wrote down is after the topics and we discussed, then whoever is facilitating it, or any one of us, I guess that wasn't ironed out, asked, do we have a consensus?
Does anyone have comments or questions that they would like to make at this time if we are going to come to consensus about Chris's sabbatical in 2024?
So we're going to have a full discussion now because the meeting's supposed to be over, and Jan said that we keep to the timeframes too.
And so this is Gary. So my comment is, yes, if we're not at a point where we have consensus, then yes, I think we do have to agree to carry it over. But I don't know that there's not consensus. That's what I wasn't clear about.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask a question. And if you don't feel like you have consensus, then please say so. Do we have consensus for Chris's sabbatical in 2024?
I think it's a good idea too.
Thumbs up if you do. Okay.
Dare I ask the question, is thumbs up voting?
No.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, just
Thank you.
making sure.
Same as
Thank you
Just
for that
making
consensus.
sure.
No,
I
it's
just want to
because
make
we
sure
don't.
everybody feels heard. And Jill, it sounds like there are things that maybe you haven't said yet.
No, I'm just saying it's because
Okay.
we're not all in the same room and we can't observe everybody's body language. So we
Right.
have to do something.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay.
That's how I
Okay.
took it.
If you don't have consensus over the 2024 sabbatical for Chris, please just say so.
Sabbaticals always sort of scare me because I am worried that I'll miss the leadership, but it sounds like Chris, you're working on a transition so that we are covered in your absence.
We will be, yes, most definitely. So,
I would like to say that, it's always scary to be 3 months without your leader. But in Chris's call, it was in his contract that he would have this. So we would be in breach of contract if we did not grant it to him at this point.
okay, so one more time. Are we in consensus for Chris's sabbatical in 2024?
Yes.
Okay. Chris, you can have a sabbatical in 2024 with
Thank
our
you,
blessing.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you
Genuinely.
to all. I need somebody, we're going to close, but if somebody would shoot me an email and say they would be willing to do the meditation in May, I would be ever so grateful. And then with that, Gary, if you will close us out in prayer, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Oh God, who unites us in this place across miles through all the magic of technology, we give you great thanks for bringing us together to not only drive the work of the region and most especially your work in our region as our God and our leader in faith, but that you would also give thanks to you also this opportunity to bring the region forward in a new way, to a new way of decision making, to very likely pull us together in our hearts, in our minds, in our spirits to learn how to work in consensus, but always with the focus on what is God calling us to do. And we've taken a great step forward in learning about that tonight. And I give thanks for that and for all of these people on this call. Bless us with a night of peace, with a night of rest, and with some time of quiet. We pray these things in the name of God. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks all.
We have consensus that the meeting is adjourned 5 minutes late.
Yes.
Blessings.
Good night.
Good night.